Welcome, everyone, to our webinar today called Best Practices for Live Virtual Training. My name is Susan Cullen, and I'm President of Quantum Learning Solutions and will be your speaker for today's session. I'd like to begin by just giving you a little bit of background about me, and then we'll look at our agenda for this next hour. As President of Quantum, I was actually a very early adopter of live virtual training. I started using it in the year 2000. So I will tell you that the technology has advanced significantly since then, quite a bit in the last 10 years. And I've learned a lot of it. I learned a lot about it along the way, and I'm happy to be sharing that with you today. I also have developed quite a few self-paced online courses in both the areas of leadership and employee development. And Quantum's clients consist of many Fortune 100 companies as well as smaller organizations. Now, we want to make this fairly interactive today. We did have, I think, 220 people who registered for this session. So we've muted all the phone lines, and this has limited our interaction probably more than we would have if we were having an actual live virtual training class. But we will be using quite a few polling questions. There is also a place for you to ask questions if you want to send us a question. Where you see that on your screen, you can go ahead and type in a question, and one of our assistants in our office is monitoring all the questions for us, so she'll be able to get back to you immediately. And we will be using the hand-raising feature occasionally as I begin to prompt you to raise your hands, and you can probably see that there's a little hand on next to your screen as well, so you can use that when prompted to raise your hands, and I can see how many people are responding as we go. Now, in anticipation of questions, we have one very frequently asked question, which is, will I receive a copy of the webinar recording of this session today? And yes, we would like to let you know that all registered attendees will receive a copy within the next 24 to 36 hours. So you will be getting that. And with that thought in mind, then let's go ahead and get started. Again, this session will last about an hour. Also, we will have a place for me, we'll have some time set aside for me to answer your questions at the end of the session as time allows. So let's look at why this session was developed and really what topic is it that we're really wanting to look at. And, you know, when we talked about why we created this session today, we had heard a lot from our own clients about some of the challenges that they're facing and some of the highest priorities that they're facing as managers and leaders in the area of learning and training and development and anything related to workplace learning and performance. And they said that there were two things that were, you know, consistently challenging them right now, and this was also verified in the ASTD, American Society of Training and Development, State of the Industry report. And that was those two things that you see on your slide right now. You know, how do we, in today's economy, reduce our costs and or at the same time make things more efficient, which could also help us reduce our costs. And simultaneously, how do we also increase the effectiveness of the programs that we have? So it's kind of like, you know, how do we maximize our learning function on a training budget that's minimized? So I'd like to see if this relates to you. I'm going to ask you right now if you can relate to this, to just raise your hand, and I'll be able to see a percentage of how many of you are saying, yes, that's a challenge that we're facing right now. So if you could please go ahead and raise your hand and let me see how many of you are identifying with this challenge yourself, then I'll know that I'm on track and this is probably the type of thing that really meets your needs at this point. And it looks like we're getting the numbers coming in frantically. We're at 67% already that have raised your hands. So I'm sure that this is something that's probably very common for most of you right now. So with that thought in mind, this is why we've created our agenda for today. And that is to look at why do we want to address live virtual training. And we'll be sharing a lot of research with you about that today, and also give you some real nuts and bolts ideas for how you can use some of the best design practices to really make your live virtual training as effective as it possibly can. You know, just a few of the things we'll be talking about are the technical issues, what types of skills do you want your virtual trainers to have, also really what's important in a transfer climate. How do you get your learners to transfer your content back to the job? And last but not least, what's really good course designs for live virtual training? So we're going to be looking at all of those. And I think that the best way to really understand, some good design practices is to give you some case study examples. So I'll be sharing with you several of those that we have used really to give you a good idea of how to put it all together. Now, when we talk about online training, there are lots of things to consider. For one thing, the technology is advancing so much and so fast. And in a little bit later in this session today, I'm going to be talking about Web 2.0 and informal learning and really what do we see coming up in the landscape of the future. But a lot of times when people think of online training, they'll think of these three things that you see here. Live virtual, which is the topic of today's session. They also many times think of, online self-paced training, that you go through on your own. And many times people also think of this as blended learning, where you might blend a live virtual session or online self-paced courseware with the traditional face-to-face classroom training. So I'm actually going to be spending most of the time today on live virtual, but we'll also talk about how to blend it with self-paced and how to blend it with classroom, and especially talk about how that fits together when we look at some of the case study examples. So let's talk about your impressions of live virtual training and what do most people think about it. And, one thought that people can sometimes think about live virtual training is, well, it's just not as engaging as the classroom. You don't really see people. It's harder to get them in groups. And so sometimes people think it's just not that engaging. Or they'll think, on the other side of the coin, well, but it is less expensive. It can be less expensive. Sometimes people will think, well, it'll never replace, the face-to-face classroom. Sometimes people will think, well, it's actually faster to complete. And sometimes people will think, well, this is just a fad, and it's probably going to go away, and it's not going to be with us forever. And I'm curious right now. I'm going to launch a polling question, and I'd like for you to select for yourself. Let us know, what do you think is true here? You can select one or many of these, but please put a check mark next to what you believe to any of these is true about live virtual training. What's your impression of live virtual training? And, it can be one of these. It can be several of these. Feel free to click any that you think apply. And then in just a minute, we're going to take a look at what the class said and what the group said and give you a chance to benchmark your own impressions against other people in the session today. So those answers are still coming in. And then we're going to talk about really what we've seen in our experience seems to be true of live virtual training today. So I'm going to actually now at this point share with you the results. And this is what we're seeing happening. It looks like by far 76% of you are saying this is less expensive, which means that, yes, it can be, primarily because it doesn't involve any type of travel. And I'm happy to see that I see quite a few of you are still saying it will never replace face-to-face classroom. I will agree with you about that. I think that based on the topic that you're training, there are a lot of things that are best delivered in a face-to-face classroom style. Sometimes people will use live virtual training to reinforce the traditional classroom, or they'll use it for for other types of community building. But when you need to do a lot of certain types of skill practice exercises and role plays, that's really best in face-to-face classroom, unless you find a creative alternative, which I can also share we have found. Many of you are saying it can be faster to complete. It can be if it's delivered in shorter segments, but what we also know is that it can, you can have several segments just spread out over time. So it's not always true that it's faster to complete. I think it depends on how many sessions you have. And it's interesting that about 35% said it really wasn't as engaging. We're going to look at some ways to make it very engaging. And based on the delivery that you use, the trainer, and how interactive you make it, it can be extremely engaging. What's interesting is that we only have 1% of you who are saying it's just a fad. And I think that you're right. We're going to be looking at the results of that in just a minute, because this is really going to be something that's going to be with us for a while as we look at what's happening with learning and the needs of learners going into the future. So with that thought in mind, I'd also like to ask you one more question so that I know a little bit about you as we get started. How frequently does your organization provide live virtual training now? And please let us know if you've had quite a bit of experience, it's something you frequently do, or if it's something you're just getting involved with and you're wanting to learn more about it as you go. So please go ahead and just select one of those options. And it looks like actually we've got quite a few of you who are saying frequently. That's still coming in. So I'm going to actually close the poll now, though, and show you what our answers say at this point. And it looks like we're seeing that we've got 52% are frequently using it. So I'm glad to see that. It's just about half of you. We're seeing several of you, 23% just getting started, and about 18% occasionally using it. 7% haven't started at all. So for that group, I hope you find this helpful and interesting as we get started today. I think you're entering into a new world of opportunities that has a great deal of potential in the learning field. So let's go ahead at this point then and get started to begin to look at why provide live virtual training? Why is it gaining so much momentum today? And let's look at just what's happening now to give us an idea about why we're seeing so much of it. And so at least 52% of you are saying that you're frequently using it. And that is because, a lot of companies in today's economy have been having budget cuts that even if your budget hasn't been significantly reduced, spending is highly scrutinized. A lot of people are saying that there has been a reduction in travel costs. And yet, at the same time, probably in many cases, there are real business needs that professional development and learning need to address. And so the need is growing. And a lot of people in the learning and development field are feeling as if they've got to find another way to deliver training in an effective way. And that's why we're starting to see so much of it beginning to be utilized now. Really looking at the whole age-old question of how do you keep productivity on an upswing, when the economy is going into a downturn, and that's one of the reasons why people have been using it more. Now, when we start to look at really what's happening out in industries and companies across the United States, there was a very interesting study done last quarter by, again, the American Society of Training and Development, where they looked at the confidence index of learning executives, and they found that 57% of learning executives are restricting travel for learners. That means that in some cases, in many of these cases in the study, we're also restricting travel for the instructors. So travel was greatly reduced. And that we also saw that 49% reported at the same time an increased usage of e-learning and virtual delivery. So, we're seeing it beginning to pick up. And I thought it would be interesting for you to see just what percentage of training was delivered in each of these formats last year. You can see that in this particular example, it's broken down by small to large-size companies. We can see that blended learning, which is a combination of face-to-face with virtual, is really at somewhere between 20 to 25%. Blended learning is a real trend that you may have seen yourself that is really growing and will probably continue to grow because it's a combination of, so many things that can be so effective. Now, we're also seeing that somewhere between 40 to almost 50% of companies are still using just instructor-led classrooms, but notice that that's a lot less than it was 10 years ago. What we're also seeing is that somewhere between almost 9 and 11% are just using virtual classroom, which is, kind of the type of format that we're doing now, some type of live virtual training. And about, 15 to 22% are using online or computer-based methods only with no instructor. Now, there's a much, much smaller group that's using social networking and mobile training only through cell phones or iPods, for example. But I think you can see it gives you an idea to benchmark your own organization against, what we saw in other companies last year. Now, also what's happening is it's important to anticipate not just what other companies did last year, but what's going to happen in the future. What's learning in the future going to look like? And I know that, we've been talking about Generation X and Y. Everybody's been talking about Generation X and Y for several years now. that's not new. But what we're starting to see is Generation Z is going to be appearing in the workforce in the next 5 or so years. Now, they're about 14 years old now, so in about 5 or so years, we're going to see them entering more and more into the workforce. And what that means is for Generation Y and Z, they grew up on technology. So they really are going to be looking for technology as a format for learning in the future. In fact, it's interesting. I loved this terminology where they talk about the difference between a digital immigrant and a digital native. Now, a digital immigrant is usually probably someone who's a baby boomer or beyond, who learned to adapt by using technology. Kind of resisted it, and would probably still, we talk about retaining their original accents. They'll adapt to it, but they're still used to kind of doing it the way they always did, and that's where they're most comfortable. But the digital natives, so now we're talking about Generation Y and Z, they grew up with technology. They're native speakers of computers. They grew up with video games and the Internet. They had it in school, and they think and process information fundamentally differently. Technology is like air to them. So what that means is we're going to be seeing a real new breed of learner, and that new breed of learner, first of all, is a very skilled multitasker. And the reason that they are is because they've been doing it with technology. They're using they're texting all the time. I don't know about you, but I've gotten very frustrated seeing them trying to text at the dinner table when you go out to dinner, and they just can't almost unwind from it. They also, because of the use of technology, they want pictures and sounds and video, and they relate to that more than they do just the printed word. They also want bite-sized pieces of information. So they don't want to sit in a class for longer periods of time. They want shorter segments that are very targeted and focused on their just-in-time needs. We also see that they're social technologically. They want to be part of a community, so they share and exchange information all the time through the web. And they want to be able to access it immediately. So they'll Google something, or they'll use Wikipedia if they want to find out immediately something that they need. So that's what we're seeing with that new breed of learner. Now, I'd be curious at this point right now. We're going to launch another poll and just give you an opportunity to let us know how comfortable do you feel with some of the technology that we have today. So be honest here. Nobody's going to see your immediate answers. But let us know, how frequently on a weekly basis do you read a wiki or something like Wikipedia? Do you read blogs? Do you visit a photo site like Flickr or a video site like YouTube? Do you listen to podcasts? How actively involved in social networking are you? So send your thoughts over. Be honest. Don't hesitate. Don't be shy. See what your answers are. And this will also give you an opportunity to really kind of benchmark yourself, again, against other people in the class. So we still have some answers coming in. Let's take just another minute or so. Now, one of the reasons that I like the ability to use polling questions is that this is a good example of being able to use anonymity. It can encourage people that normally wouldn't want to always answer questions to be a lot more open about it. Now, this is what we see with our results. We see about 52% of you are using social networks, so I'm glad to see that. Again, it's about half of you. It's still a new thing to many people, and it's something, there's a lot to learn about it there. That about 14% of you are using Wikipedia, and some people have an internal one within their organization. About 3%, this is the smallest group, is reading blogs. It's interesting, probably, I'm guessing that a lot more of you are on the photo or video sites are going to YouTube as opposed to Flickr. But again, those are just other things to begin to start to look at. So again, we've got, this is something that we're getting used to, that people are starting to learn about. So let's start to then, at this point, begin to address what are the benefits of live virtual training then? Well, one thing is it is going to support the new breed of learner, which we've got to be able to do in the future. Also, again, as we've talked about, there are reduced travel costs. A lot of people who are saying that they want their budget for workplace learning and performance to go to workplace learning and not to go to travel. But, again, this is a way to maximize that. I think a really big issue, though, is that a lot of people are saying that they want to be able to have less time away from work. And you're probably hearing that from your learners. This is probably a bigger issue than any today. And also we hear people say that they want it to be highly tailored to their organization so that it's really most relevant and very current. And with live virtual training, because you're basically using a PowerPoint presentation, it's really easy for you to do that. Also what we see is that when you design it effectively, and we'll be talking about how to do this, you can actually encourage more learner accountability and application to the work environment than you could have in the traditional face-to-face training, because you have bite-sized sessions with action plans in between sessions and things that people are held accountable for delivering on, and you can see your retention in learning go way up because of that. Another thing that I think is really important is that you can really make your senior managers and their support for your programs highly visible in a live virtual format, because you can either have them speak or have a recorded session of them speaking, or you can have a PowerPoint slide with quotes from them and make their support of your program very, very visible through the whole process. Another thing that's kind of interesting to look at, and just in those of you who are familiar with, I'm sure most of you in the session today, of how we learn, is that live virtual learning uses all your senses. So your hands are moving, your fingers are clicking, your eyes are hearing, your ears are hearing, your eyes are seeing. Now, it uses 3 of those senses, but the thing is you've got to constantly keep it moving. You've got to have a lot of PowerPoint slides that you go through. You've got to be having polling questions and hand raising and text chat and get people really involved. But it can help learners to learn by using all of those things at one time. Another real benefit to live virtual learning is that it can help some of your more shy learners be more participative. There's no judgments whatsoever due to someone's appearance, attributes, or ethnicity. So we all know the participant who, in the traditional face-to-face classroom, the one who comes in, sits in the front, always raises their hand, gives you lots of eye contact. They can very easily overshadow the shy person who wants to hide in the back. But with live virtual training, it evens the playing field. And, a good example is, bringing in any polling question that people might not want to raise their hand to because it's anonymous, they feel more comfortable. And many times you'll find that the shyer learner is much more participative in a live virtual class. So there's a lot of benefits to live virtual training. Let's talk now about what are some of the best ways to design it and share some design best practices. And I'm going to be giving you several tips as we go through it. I think the very first one that is extremely important in any learning design, but especially with live virtual, is that you've got to first of all identify what's your key critical needs that most clearly address your business initiatives, and what do you need people to do, and design your training content around those key critical business initiatives. And then make sure that you are securing visible support from senior leadership throughout the process. Now, again, this is not new, but because live virtual training is new, having visible leadership support is even more important because it helps people adapt to change, and the more visible you make it, the better it's going to be. Another really, really important thing is to make it interactive, and this is how you make it engaging. So let's look at some ways to do that. One way to make it interactive is with hand raising. One way to make it interactive is with text chat. So, the way that we use this, we use text chat a lot in training programs where we will ask people, what's your one goal that you want to focus on in this class? And when you have a class size that's, no larger than 20, 25, you can see everyone's answer to that question. They're committing it to writing. The chat, you can also ask for their ideas, and you make it a lot more interactive, which, of course, we can't do when we've got, 200 people on the session as we do now. Another thing is to use polling questions, which I've been using some here. That, again, will let you see the percentage of people responding, and that also keeps it interactive. whiteboarding is another example of how to make it interactive. So with a lot of the platforms in a smaller group, it's as if you can write something on a whiteboard, and you actually write it on the screen as you go. So if you have a new idea or a new thing come up that you want to add to your PowerPoint slide, you can add it in and whiteboard it. A very effective use that I've seen with some platforms and with some of our clients is to use a webcam. And the way that they've done it, and I think they use the Adobe Connect platform, is that the facilitator had a webcam, everybody could see me, but also every participant had a webcam. And at the bottom of the screen, I could see every person sitting in front of their computer. And I think, the class size was limited to about 15 people. But what happened was that they could, I could visually see them. So when they wanted to raise their hand, I could see them raise their hand. I could say, how many of you would agree with this? Please raise your hand. And I could see them all raise their hands. So it was really an excellent way to keep us all connected. Another one is with games. One of my other clients actually had games that they used kind of for online games that they used while people were waiting for the classes to start. It was a great way of building an interactivity and adding some fun. People sometimes bring in video elements. I know that we have done that as well, where you can show a piece of a video on screen and your learners can watch that too. And another one is breakout rooms. With a lot of platforms, you can actually use your breakout room by sending people to small groups. They then go into their small group and they might discuss something, and then the facilitator can sit in on those small groups, and check in and see how they're doing and have everybody reconvene at a certain time. So these are all great ways to really make it interactive. And what I'd like to do now is let's just see what your experience has been. And when those of you who have been using live virtual courses, you can select one or multiple options here. But please let us know, what do you most frequently do in your learning programs? What are you finding that you most recently do? And I see a question. Someone was wanting to know an example of blended learning. Blended learning would be, really basically looking at taking face-to-face classroom with live virtual on the back end and maybe online self-paced up front. So that would be an example of blended learning. Okay, so let's see what we've got here as the answers are coming in to this particular question. And it looks like, as we start to see how you responded, in our live virtual classes, it looks like 69% of you are using text chat, which really works well when you've got a smaller group. It makes it very interactive. And then obviously what you can do is, have people talk on the telephone and talk about what they meant in their chat or respond further. 81% are using polling questions. That's great. Webcams, I think, is a way, something that we might see more in the future. It's a great idea and something to look into if you're considering it further. About a quarter of you are using breakout rooms, and 74% are using hand raising. So, again, lots of things to think about as ways to make it interactive. Another thing that we begin to start to look at as really important for best practices on live virtual learning is to focus on learner care. So that means that before a class starts, you've got a producer or an administrative person or someone who's really going to be doing a good job of having some type of high-touch campaign to make sure everybody knows how to log in, they have all the handout materials that they need, they are familiar with the platform that you're using, they're very comfortable with the whole process. So if it's a new group who hasn't been exposed to your platform before, you really want to make sure that you have some good learner care initially, and also that you follow up with what they may need as you go. Another thing that's really important is to manage your logistics. So a lot of times you might be scheduling things around several different time zones. You want to make sure you communicate that, because sometimes people can easily mistake what time it's going to start. And if you have a group that's, let's say, reconvening over several weeks, one of the things that we find really works is to make sure you keep it on the same day of the week and the same time, and you're not changing that, just to make it a little easier for people to make sure that they're there at the right time. We also highly encourage you to send reminders like we did for this webinar today. It's so easy with so much email that we all get now to have things get buried, and then when you're ready to try to find, how to log in, you can't find it. You're definitely going to need production support whenever you do a live virtual session. And by that we mean you've got someone on the session with you who's monitoring the questions, like Kathy is doing for me right now, who's really kind of coaching you behind the scenes so that they can really be very attentive to the learners on the session. And you want to make sure you're really comfortable with your technology before you start. So practice in advance if you're not. You also want to make sure that you help people get very comfortable with skilled virtual training techniques. So it takes a very different skill set to really be a virtual trainer than to be a face-to-face trainer. A face-to-face trainer has the ability to use a lot of body movement, facial expressions. They can see sometimes much more easily what's going on. You don't have that as a virtual trainer. So your voice skills are very important, and you've got to, most of all, make sure you really keep it moving. So you need to have lots of slides. You need to have people doing things and watching things constantly. And you've got to be pretty organized. You can't, just change things on the fly. There have been, like you can in face-to-face trainings. I will tell you as a face-to-face trainer, co-facilitating with, someone else, there have been times when we've stood behind the flip chart and thought, we need to go in a different direction with this group than we planned in order to really meet, their needs on the spot. And you can't do that as easily with virtual training. So you've got to be pretty organized. And you've got to be able to work well with your producers and your technical assistants. You really count on them, and you can't be a lone wolf to do this. Let me give you some examples about how a good platform trainer is not always a good virtual trainer. One example was, you think of, we had one trainer who's a real high-energy facilitator in the classroom. A lot of people really like her. She's just very, very dynamic. But in doing virtual training, some people thought that she was too loud. Her voice was too loud. So sometimes you have to really coach people with this. Another example can be a trainer who's very knowledgeable, knows his stuff, but somewhat soft-spoken, however, uses a lot of funny facial expressions to make his point come across. In some cases, he can be perceived as a snore. So you've got to make sure that you've got skilled virtual trainers. And if you're just beginning to do this yourself, I really encourage you to get a mentor to help you, because that can be important in your delivery. Another thing that's really critical is to design the course in smaller segments. So design it to focus on doing a few important things well, rather than covering everything you would do. If you have a 2-day training class, you need to break that 2 days up into 60 to 90-minute sessions. We used to say in the face-to-face classroom that usually after about 90 minutes, people physically need a bio break. And, the same holds true in a live virtual session. So you don't want to go longer than 90 minutes max. And I think it's also best if you can keep your class size to about the same size you would expect in the traditional face-to-face classroom. So probably, 20 or less is ideal, because it encourages more interactivity. You want your learners to be talking. You want them to raise their hands so that you can call on them. And you want to make sure that you can keep it as interactive as possible. Another really important idea is to make your live virtual training a process as opposed to an event. And by process we mean, again, you've got smaller pieces spread out over time. But this can be really a way to maximize learning when you assign implementation activities between sessions. So people have field exercises and action plans and goals that they're held accountable for completing between the first session and the second session, and then you hold them accountable. They're accountable to their manager. You're finding out what they're doing differently. You can monitor it. And this structure can really help make your learning even more impactful than what we sometimes thought of as just the traditional face-to-face learning. Another key element is to make sure that you are consistently reinforcing with all kinds of resources. So you want to have, handout tools for on-the-job application. You want to have reference resources that people can find. A lot of times we will use an online self-paced course either as pre-work or as reinforcement. And by the way, we found that when we use it as pre-work and we use one of our online self-paced courses that are really interactive and engaging, which all of ours are, we have found that we have over a 95% completion rate for self-paced learning, which is extremely high. If you leave your learners on their own to complete self-paced courseware on their own time and there's not any accountability built in, you won't get that type of completion rate. But you could use it as reinforcement as well. Our practice is we almost always have some type of live virtual reinforcement session because everybody has an action plan, and when they come back to the next live virtual reinforcement session, we ask them how it's going and expect them to report out, and that also really increases the likelihood that they're going to follow through and transfer learning to the job. And you could use coaches to, coach people virtually over the telephone as well. Another really important tip is to have a lot of support and communication through the whole process. So one thing that we use a lot is what we call a reinforcement tips newsletter, which we create for the class. And in those newsletters, here's where we've been able to very visibly show support from the senior leader, because we would have a letter from that senior leader on the first page of the newsletter that's going out to everyone. And again, you can help the leader draft that letter, but that's also showing support for your programs. A lot of times what we do in our reinforcement tips newsletters is that we also include a survey with questions in it about, how are you implementing what we talked about in the class. And this enables us to have a really good pulse on what's happening with the learners and what they need to do, where are they struggling, where are they succeeding, so that we know what we need to do between sessions to support them. So again, you want to keep your reinforcement tips newsletters as a two-way dialogue for them to respond back to you between sessions, and it becomes really an effective tool. Another thing that's important is to strengthen your transfer climate. Now, by transfer climate, we mean helping people take your learning concepts back to the job. So again, have action plans with specific goals and targets that they're to do between sessions, and ask them to go back and share their action plan with their immediate manager or supervisor so that they're on track with that. Expect, when they know that they will be accountable, when they come back for a live virtual reinforcement session that they're going to have to report out, you will see a real spike in their application on the job. And, also use the reinforcement resources we talked about. And Web 2.0 technology is growing. It's going to be much more active in the workplace in the future. So let's talk about what this is if you're not familiar with it. Web 2.0 is really looking at web-based communities such as blogging, podcasts sometimes, online social networks. It's basically known for having a really free exchange of information among a lot of people. Now, this is a great place to use it if you're, let's say you want to have a learning community after a class and you want people to go in and share their thoughts, what's working well, how are they applying something with the other participants. And it enables your participants to also share information. So it's not coming from the facilitator or the instructor. It's coming both ways. So when we begin to, again, look at the ASTD State of the Industry report for last year, we saw that there was by far a big percentage. You can see here it's, over 86% who said they were more likely to use Web 2.0 technologies in the next 3 years. So this is growing. It's not a fad. It's not going to go away, and it's something that's going to continue. And I'd like to ask you to raise your hand at this point. Again, if you go back to the hand-raising feature, do you think you are more interested in using Web 2.0 in the next 3 years yourself? So let's just see kind of how that plays out for people. I'd be interested in letting you let me know what you see with that. Do you think you also are more interested in using Web 2.0 technologies in the next 3 years? And I'm seeing the percentages come in. We're at about 40% of you right now. It's still going. So again, I think what we can see is that a lot of people are saying, I want to learn about this. It's still uncharted territory. We're still learning about it, but it's likely to change, especially as we have younger learners entering the workforce. They're very adept at it. So it's one of those things that we're going to want to continue to be using. And it looks like we had about 65% of you who said yes, you were interested in using it in the future. So that takes us to this next topic, which is really all about building learning communities. And that means using social media or a wiki to capture questions from the participants in the course. Now, let me give you an example of how this worked with one of our clients. We were facilitating an innovation class for a Fortune 500 consumer electronics company, and this was their R&D group that was basically responsible for creating and designing all their new products. So, we did several sessions around the country, and as a result of the class, they started using a wiki on their internal secure site to exchange ideas. Now, what happened was we had people that we were working with in the Silicon Valley. We had people, out in New Jersey. We had people in Princeton. We had people in New York. So the whole innovation R&D group wasn't always communicating. And this internal wiki on a secure site, was a way for them to share ideas, and their innovation really improved as a result of it. A wiki is like a Wikipedia site. It's like if you want to be able to jot down what worked for you and then be able to search like an encyclopedia and search and find out what you need to find out in terms of information or what have other people found or how does something work. It's a great tool that I think we'll start to see more of, as well as what we think of with, social media processes, blogging, and so forth. I think the key to this is to really make it a learning community. It's going both ways between the participants to each other, and it makes it easier then for them to search on in a just-in-time fashion for any types of questions they might have. Another really important best practice idea is to insist on accountability. And, it may depend on how long your program is or how much time you have allocated to it. But, pre- and post-course measurement can be a very effective tool. In more in-depth, longer programs, we use 360 feedback quite a bit. And, it's easy to measure performance with very straightforward classes that are dealing more with technical or administrative skills, but it's harder for things that are interpersonal in nature or leadership or management. And so when you use some type of assessment like a multi-rater feedback or 360 feedback at intervals throughout your training, you can find out how well people have progressed. And you can find out then if your training worked and measure improvements over costs. And, we have a mathematical formula that we use to measure, return on investment using 360 over time. So that's a key thing to use for pre- and post-course measurement. For some companies, they have more sophisticated performance management tools they can use online to incorporate some of this, and so that's really great. But again, what it does is it helps you, if you're in the learning function, to communicate ROI, return on investment, to your senior leaders. So that's only going to be a benefit to you to help justify some of the things that you're doing. So I hope that gives you some ideas for best practice design. I want to illustrate it for you and give you some real good examples with some case studies of 4 different programs of how we structure them to incorporate a lot of things that we've been talking about. It's just easier to understand this way, I think. This one is a traditional blended face-to-face learning classroom with live virtual and self-paced virtual and other virtual reinforcement tools. So again, the way that it's structured is that everybody starts with pre-work where they do their 360 feedback. So we have a baseline assessment. They also complete an online self-paced course before they even come into the classroom. So that we can spend more time in the classroom, not so much on information sharing, but on skill plays and role practices and things like that. The classroom itself, of course, is very customizable. It can be as long as anyone may need based on the topics that they want to include. But I think, what's also important is to put a lot of emphasis on reinforcement here. So, we encourage them to share their action plan that they created in class with their manager. Another thing that we found works really, really well, and here's where I think there's a great application for live virtual learning, and that is to have a reinforcement session after your face-to-face classroom session at intervals throughout the year. So we've traditionally done it at least the 1-month mark and the 6-month mark. And those are really highly interactive sessions. It's very rewarding for our facilitators to hear how people have been applying the concepts discussed in the classroom. And, there's a lot of camaraderie usually among the participants as well. You can also use online self-paced courses for reinforcing what you want. And, again, the newsletter that I mentioned that goes includes surveys to measure how people are doing and have two-way feedback throughout the process. We basically do that every 2 months for a year. So, again, our sessions are not just the time you spend in the classroom, but it's really, involving more than almost a year's worth of focus. It's interesting what we look at here. We had an independent researcher go back and interview the participants in these classes and find out how well were they applying these concepts at, anywhere between 6 to 12 months after the traditional face-to-face classroom class. And they found that 80% of them are still applying the classroom concepts up to 1 year later, which is extremely high. The learning and development, workplace learning, and performance field know. But, again, it's because of the design and having a lot of emphasis on reinforcement and application. This is another example of one that was done completely virtual. This is with an insurance company that had 500 insurance adjusters nationwide, and they had very high turnover among those adjuster rates, which tended to be pretty indicative of the industry as a whole, but it's a high turnover rate. And the way that we started this is that we began with an employee retention survey. They were able to identify that, 52% of people and 52% of their adjusters who left within the first year. So that enabled us to then know what our needs needed to be. Now, we began with one live virtual session where we had all 500 people on the line, and we had the senior-most leader in the company with me to really talk about what was going to be involved, why was this important, how he wanted everyone to be involved in this, and so that made him very visible in the process. We then had an online self-paced course assigned each month, and they had action plans embedded in their self-paced course so that when they came back for the live virtual session that month, their senior leaders had an opportunity to know what people were doing well, and they could call on them to talk about what they were doing that worked, and we got tremendous response from this. I think we were able to reduce their turnover by several percentage points as a result of that, and it, of course, significantly impacted their bottom line. Now, this is an example of a company that just wanted to focus on a few basic fundamental management skills, but they had a geographically dispersed workforce of managers, and so, again, this is a combination of live self-paced courses with live virtual courses and a lot of the reinforcement resources that we talked about. And then last but not least is just taking one segment. This one is for our time management program. It's interesting because this is actually our most frequently requested topic. And it's kind of interesting because people will say, I know I need time management, I know I need to improve my time management, but I just don't have time to take a class. And so what we do is we have them complete a profile as pre-work where they're able to identify, where their strengths and development needs are among 10, time categories like setting priorities or setting goals. And then they'd have a 90-minute webinar where at the end of that webinar they are to complete an action plan. And then a month later, come back for the reinforcement webinar. And, again, we hear a lot of things around that about how they're doing and see a lot of success as we go through the process. So that's, another example of kind of a different way to schedule that. So we've got a lot of topics that we've broken down this way. If you would like to see receive a catalog of our live virtual course offerings so you can really see, get an idea of what are the different ways that you can actually, what are the different topics you could actually do in a live virtual format, please just indicate yes or no, and those of you that indicate yes, we'll go ahead and email that out to you. We'd be happy to do that so that you can see some of the things that are there. What we've basically done is we've taken a lot of the things that would be a longer 2 or 3 day class, for example, and broken them into shorter segments and built in assessments and reinforcement pieces into them. Some people will try to make it just a series and have a series of those, and some people might be interested in just 1 or 2. Okay. One of the things that I'd also just like to mention as we're going is that next month we're going to have a really interesting webinar for those of you that are interested. Again, all of these are free webinars. Next month we're going to be talking about how to increase your sales productivity of your sales force and doing it in a live virtual way. And what this basically does is it helps you grow your top line through your sales productivity by also controlling your bottom line and doing it virtually. We're going to have 2 guest speakers for this session next month. They are both the principals of a company called CRK Interactive. They are the co-authors of 2 books, one in sales and one in sales management. And they're also the co-hosts of a popular radio show called Let's Talk Sales. So that is going to be Thursday, April 22nd, again, the same time as we do this one from 3 to 4. So we'd love for you to be able to join us for that if you would like to. And if you would like to receive our newsletter, and that has all our future webinar invitations in that, please just indicate yes or no, and we're happy to accommodate you and send you something about those if you would like. So at this point, I want to begin to start to look at some of the questions that we might have and try to spend. I know we've got about 6 minutes or so to answer any questions. If you have any specific questions that I haven't been able to answer yet, please feel free to send us those, and